Indian farmers are among the restless growers from different parts of the world who are demanding a better lot. Farmers from states near New Delhi have been trying to march to the capital for weeks to stage protests for higher prices for their crops. This comes as a general election is around the corner, with Prime Minister Narendra Modi seeking a rare third term in power in a country where agriculture is the biggest employer. Farmers here have ploughed these fields for generations. It's a way of life, and they're proud to be part of a state that's known as the food bowl of India, producing rice, wheat and other crops in abundance. But beneath the tranquility, discontent has been growing. Farmers from Punjab, along with other northern states, started protesting last month. They want assured prices for their crops, along with debt relief, pensions and several other demands. Two unions called for the protests with general elections just weeks away. Among the protesters is Rajinder Singh.
इंडिया में फार्मिंग करनी, खेती करनी बहुत ज़्यादा मुश्किल है। आप मेरे साथ ही हो, आप ही देखो यहाँ पे खेती करने के लिए प्रॉपर साधन नहीं है। साधन है तो वो कॉस्टली है। फार्मर, छोटे फार्मर है, 2 से 4 एकड़ वाले, वो उसको अफोर्ड नहीं कर सकते।
Many ended up taking loans to purchase that farming equipment. Vijinder's relatively better off than the small-scale farmers he mentions. He and his family own 40 acres of land where they grow rice and wheat. But even he has some $25,000 worth of debt in farm loans, taken out in years that his crops have failed, destroyed by floods and pests.
अगर हमें प्रॉफिट होगा तभी हम अपना लोन भर पाएंगे। जब हमें प्रॉफिट ही नहीं होता है, हम तो लॉस में ही जा रहे हैं।
He says that if the government introduces a legal guarantee on what's known as minimum support prices for all crops, and at higher rates, this would help them to secure a better income. The demand for legally guaranteed minimum support prices is central to these protests. The government announces support prices for more than 20 crops a year, but state agencies largely only buy wheat and rice at these rates. Many farmers want the scheme expanded to include other crops, which some say is simply not feasible. Minimum support prices might help farmers, but they don't necessarily help the economy or the wider population. Economists say that price guarantees on crops can push up food inflation, and rising food costs have been a persistent problem in India over the past couple of years. More importantly, the protesting farmers want the scheme written into law, which they claim was promised to them.
उसमें सरकार ने जिस दिन 3 कानून वापस लिए थे, तो उसमें 9 दिसंबर को चिट्ठी लिखी थी केंद्र ने कि हम आपको एमएसपी गारंटी कानून बना के देंगे, उसके लिए कमेटी बना दी थी।
Another promise made by Narendra Modi included assurances that he would double farmers' income.
2014, entire farmers are voting the Modi because of his promise. He failed. Again we are voting in 2019 also, but that time also, this time also, he failed. So we betrayed. We are cheated.
So the timing of the protests is no coincidence. About half of India's population depend on agriculture for their livelihoods, and that means that farmers are an important voting bloc. And the protesters here are all well aware of their ability to put pressure on the Narendra Modi government ahead of general elections. There are questions, though, over the impact these demonstrations will have. For one, its scale is much smaller than the farmers' protests a couple of years ago.
It was a unified battle that the farmer unions were waging at that particular time. Would mean about 40 farmer organizations. Now, this time, it was just 2 farmer unions which began the protest. Unless the others also join in, many believe it will not have that kind of a pressure tactic that the farmers think would work this time.
Despite several rounds of talks with union leaders, the government hasn't shown any signs of giving in. Mr. Modi is still widely expected to win a third term, despite farmers' discontent.
हम देश के सामने किसान मजदूर का एजेंडा रखेंगे कि पिछले 76 सालों में हमारी समस्या क्या है, और देश ने अगर नया प्रधानमंत्री चुनना, नई सरकार चुननी है, तो हमारा एजेंडा भी सबके सामने होगा कि अभी या तो हमारे साथ बैठ के कर लो, या नई सरकार आएगी तब भी यही एजेंडा होगा, इसको हल करना पड़ेगा.
But analysts say these issues aren't going away and will continue to be a headache for him. The crisis in the farm sector is deep-rooted, beginning well before Mr. Modi came to power.
There's a huge distress that prevails, and that prevails over the decades. It's not something that has been newly happening. So I think it should be very clear that the Indian farmer is at the bottom of the pyramid. You know, the average income of farmer is so low that, you know, it is even lower than the wages of the daily wage workers.
Official statistics show that farmers' incomes only increased by an average of 2.8% a year between 2015 and 2019. While India's economy grew by 8.4% in the last 3 months of 2023, the agriculture sector contracted by 0.8%. Farmers like Vijender are becoming increasingly disillusioned with the sector.
मैं और मेरी फैमिली में बिल्कुल नहीं चाहते कि मेरा बच्चा आगे खेती करे, क्योंकि उसके लिए सर्वे जैसे हमने सारी उम्र इसी में निकाल दी है, नहीं हमारा कुछ हुआ.
Whatever happens, it's likely he'll be the last in a long line of farmers in his family who have worked the land.
The French government is wrestling with one of the biggest crises to hit the agriculture sector in recent years. French farmers have been demonstrating against high costs in the industry, cheap imports, low salaries, the effects on their sector of the environmental transition, and price pressures from retailers. France is Europe's farming powerhouse. It is responsible for more than a third of the EU's production of oilseeds, cereals, and wine. But France's food producers have been downing tools this year. What started as a few protests in rural corners of the country has spiralled into a full-blown cross-border agricultural crisis. French farmers have been part of a Europe-wide movement against environmental rules, competition from cheap imports, and low incomes, among other issues. David Comet is a livestock farmer in Garrigues, in southern France. He farms the same land that his family has for generations. But he says that the agricultural world of today has completely changed from the past.
Qu'à l'époque de mon grand-père, quand il produisait du blé, il vendait du blé au prix du blé et il vivait du revenu que ça générait. À mon époque à moi, quand je vends du blé, j'attends d'avoir une subvention pour être sûr de pouvoir payer mes charges. Si je n'ai pas la subvention, je ne peux pas payer mes charges. Donc ce principe de la politique agricole commune, il a des choses de bien, mais il a des choses de mal.
David had to widen his economic output to continue to support his family. But the path he took was not made of mud and manure, but rather dancers and dresses. Cabaret is a world-famous French style of music and dance, normally seen in the big cities. To diversify his income, David wanted to bring the sights and sounds of traditional French burlesque performance here, setting the stage for cabaret in the countryside. David's story of creating the first cabaret on a farm inspired this 2022 film.
Le premier cabaret à la ferme de France.
But while he has diversified his farm's outputs, he shares the feeling of many of his colleagues in the sector who are fed up, who feel protest is the only outlet for their anger. Not every farmer can turn the sawdust into stardust. Behind the curtain lie major structural problems in French agriculture. Farmers want less regulation and greater protection from international competition. That puts them at odds with EU policies which have emphasised free trade as well as implementing sometimes costly environmental standards. This was the scene in January on France's A1 motorway, normally one of Europe's busiest roads, turned into a parking lot as farmers brought tractors and trailers onto the highway. Christophe Rionneau is a cattle farmer in the village of Saint-Gemme, also in the south of France. He argues that the build-up of crises, from drought to the green transition, the effects of the war in Ukraine to elevated inflation, have taken their toll on the countryside communities.
On fait finalement une accumulation de mauvaises périodes à tel point que les agriculteurs aujourd'hui de France ont eu besoin d'exprimer leur ras-le-bol, ont eu besoin de dire stop et de dire à nos décideurs, à notre gouvernement qu'on veut changer fortement notre condition.
The Paris Agriculture Show is one of the biggest farming fairs in the world. This year, more than 600,000 people attended February's event. It brings together farmers, the food and drink industry, agri-tech and agribusiness, and agriculture representatives from some 30 countries. When the farming protests expanded in January, it meant there was always going to be a renewed focus on this year's event and unavoidable pressure on government ministers attending. The French president traditionally inaugurates the show on its opening day. This year, Emmanuel Macron made a high-risk visit in among the farming crowds and exhibitors, and he did not get a warm welcome.
Non, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire? Si.
The French government has announced new financial support for farmers, a pledge to write the principle of food sovereignty into law, and bans on some imports treated with pesticides.
Nous souhaitons ce matin vous présenter cette nouvelle étape. Elle commence par un message clair, avec deux mots d'ordre pour notre agriculture: produire et protéger. Pourquoi? Parce que nous voulons être souverains. Souverains pour cultiver, souverains pour récolter, souverains pour nous alimenter.
The Prime Minister also announced reforms to what's known as the Egalim law. The policy's aim is to achieve fair remuneration for farmers by ensuring more balanced business relationships in the agricultural and food sector. Back in Saint-Gemme, Christophe illustrates how the country is wrestling with the balance between the farmers' interests, its climate targets, and other national priorities. He spent a long time at the tractor protests earlier in the year in solidarity with fellow farmers, but he knows his sector must also be future-proof.
On a une réflexion sur nos exploitations pour les faire progresser sur la question climatique, le travail avec les énergies renouvelables, avec la méthanisation de demain, avec sur l'alimentation de notre cheptel, fait que dans les années qui viennent, on aura une empreinte carbone nulle, ce qui est dans le monde de la viande quelque chose d'exceptionnel.
Agriculture only employs about 3% of the French labour force and contributes about 2% to gross domestic product. But France is the EU's leading agricultural nation, and there is outsized public support for an industry seen as feeding the nation through arduous work passed down through generations.
Italy has a long and proud history of agriculture. There are more than 1 million farms here, but that number is declining rapidly. Since the 1980s, 2/3 of all farms have closed. The industry is struggling. The European Union says it's helping farmers by trying to boost earnings and alleviate the impacts of climate change. But many farmers here disagree and say that without urgent intervention, their historic industry faces ruin. In ancient Rome, a life in agriculture was once described as profitable, delightful, and the best of all occupations. 2,000 years later, much has changed.
Ci hanno abbandonato. Soldi puntati. L'olio italiano. Prima un'organizzazione impossibile.
Farmers here in Italy share similar grievances to those elsewhere in Europe. As the cost of fuel has gone up, what many are paid for their produce has gone down. Tax rises and some EU green policies are also unpopular. But unlike some of their neighbours, many of the protests here are smaller, spontaneous, local and not controlled by a central organisation. It means every farmer has a slightly different reason for protesting. Here on the outskirts of Rome, the Coraggio Agricultural Cooperative took over some abandoned land. 9 years of hard work has transformed the site. They're improving the farm and also the local community, creating jobs and boosting knowledge of sustainable farming practices. But for Giacomo Lepri, he thinks a radical overhaul of the whole Italian agricultural system is needed.
Al momento quello che è l'agricoltore è un imprenditore come tutti gli altri, quindi in qualche modo deve correre dietro al mercato per piazzare il proprio prodotto. Ma noi non stiamo vendendo un bene di lusso, stiamo vendendo appunto un bene necessario. Quindi in teoria bisognerebbe sottrarre grossa parte del settore agricolo dalle logiche di mercato.
The government are unlikely to take such bold measures, but they are working hard to be seen as pro-farming. But cheaper produce from war-torn Ukraine flooding the market is a wider European problem, as the European Commission have committed to help the country by waiving duties for all Ukrainian food imports. In a country famous for its food, environmental organisations are concerned by the current balance of power.
La filiera del cibo vede all'apice i grandi supermercati che decidono tutto, decidono i prezzi a cui acquistare il cibo, decidono quello che i contadini devono coltivare, quindi decidono anche cosa noi mangiamo, e questo in cambio di prezzi molto bassi che schiacciano la filiera agroalimentare e quindi anche i diritti degli agricoltori.
The Italian Parliament has now passed a law recognising farmers as guardians of the environment and the territory, but many of those protesting say that doesn't go far enough.
Italy has some of the most famous produce in the world, from the wheat that's used to make pasta flour to the olives used to make the iconic oil and everything else that makes this country a global culinary powerhouse. Food is intertwined with the Italian national identity. And many farmers argue that what they're fighting for is not just their own livelihoods, but the very culture and traditions of Italy itself.
Many blame the policies coming from the EU. In Brussels, politicians have been trying to make themselves heard over the low rumble of protesting tractor engines. Environmental measures within the so-called Green Deal, designed to try and fight climate change, are seen as detrimental by a large number of farmers. Short-term pain for a long-term gain is the argument. Not acceptable is the reply of many. A recent EU bill aimed at drastically reducing pesticide use has been dropped under intense pressure from farming lobby groups. And the mood of many local farmers remains as bleak as the weather. But EU officials are staying upbeat, publicly at least, and have launched a strategic dialogue on agriculture.
We want to make sure that we can go beyond the polarization that is taking place in the public discourse between, on the one hand, farmers and those who speak out on the need to ensure food security, and on the others, those who say that we need to do everything we can to protect the environment. Those need not be, are not, and should not be contradictory goals.
Midway between Rome and Naples, this farm is as environmentally friendly as possible. Natural fertilisers, almost no machinery, and sticking to biodynamic methods has come with its own challenges. But for the farmer Danilo Schenner, that's nothing compared to the man-made problems he faces.
Io ho iniziato questo lavoro soltanto 12 anni fa. In agricoltura 12 anni è un frammento di secondo, è veramente un tempo molto molto breve e in 12 anni ho visto veramente quelli che sono gli effetti del cambiamento climatico. Ogni stagione è diversa dall'altra e dobbiamo cercare di trovare delle nuove strategie per contrastare appunto gli effetti del cambiamento climatico.
But many larger farmers here disagree with Danilo. Italy has an incredibly diverse agricultural landscape, so the solution for one might not be the solution for another. There is no neat list of demands that all farmers agree on. And some argue that with so many challenges facing the industry, now is not the time for often expensive green solutions. But the fear is that an already difficult situation with no easy fix is being made worse by the impacts of climate change.